Correct.
Yes, paper, the most useful and most used product of man. Indispensable in education, government, industry, commerce, the arts, in every field that we use it without thinking. Yet without paper, our civilization could never have been developed. To provide for the innumerable present-day uses, American mills produce enough paper each year to make a mile-wide strip that would reach to the moon. Man searched for a suitable material on which to inscribe his thought messages for future generations. He used tablets of stone and thin sheets of beaten bark. With the advent of papyrus, made from strips of reed, and parchment, made from the skins of animals, it seemed that the ultimate in writing materials had been reached. Then about the beginning of the Christian era, some 4,000 years after the invention of papyrus, Lun of Leiyang, China, developed a process in which the tree, old rags, or hemp was beaten to a fine pulp. This pulp was then mixed with water and poured over a mold made of grass cloth. The excess water drained through, leaving a film of matted fiber. After being dried in the sun and rubbed with a smooth stone, the sheet of fiber became paper, a writing material superior to all others. Its advantages for the dissemination of knowledge were immediately recognized. One of the early Chinese emperors had a library of 50,000 volumes before European kings had learned to write their own names. The art of paper making was a carefully guarded secret. More than 100 years passed before paper was made in Western China, and more than 700 before it was produced in Samarkand. Here the Arabs forced the secret and carried it to Baghdad, then to Cairo. Finally, about the year 1100, it reached Fez in Morocco. It took 400 years for papermaking to spread throughout Europe, and 200 more to reach the eastern coast of North America, where in 1690, William Rittenhouse established a paper mill at Germantown, Pennsylvania. Nearly 17 centuries had elapsed, but the method of making paper remained essentially unchanged. Old rags, the standard paper-making material in both Europe and the colonies, were still reduced to pulp by stamping, but mechanical stampers had replaced the former laborious processes. The first crude mold developed into the flexible bamboo mold, which remained standard throughout the Orient. The wire mold, first used in 12th century Spain, became the Western standard. And on this type, all American paper was made. As the population and activity of the colonies increased, more and more paper was needed, and other paper mills were established. By 1776, over 50 mills were in operation, but it was still necessary to import large quantities of paper from Europe. At the outbreak of the Revolution, imports were cut off and an acute shortage developed. Soldiers lacked paper. Officers lacked paper. Statesmen lacked paper. The leaders of the young republic did everything in their power to encourage the paper industry. And before the close of the century, the number of mills had increased to more than 100. By this time, the rotary beater, called the Hollander, had come into general use. One of these machines could equal the output of several batteries of... But all other steps in paper manufacture were still done by hand. Each sheet was formed separately in the time-honored manner. And shake, toss, and shake. The process required both time and skill to maintain the uniformity of the sheets. The shake and toss caused the tiny fibers to become intertwined in all directions. This interlocking is the foundation on which all paper making rests. The layer of wet pulp was removed from the mold by pressing it firmly against a piece of heavy woolen cloth called a paper maker's felt. Molds were expensive, but with this method, only 2 were needed to maintain a steady production. The felts, with the freshly made paper between them, were then placed in a massive wooden press. With the aid of all men present, most of the remaining water was removed. The use of felt in paper making began in the very early days, and from that time to the present, when great endless belts of woolen cloth are used, no other material has been found that would serve this essential purpose. To complete the drying, the sheets were hung on long poles in the loft. Even today, loft drying is used for certain fine papers. Most of the early American mills were small, with an average production of less than 10 reams a day. Expansion of the industry was limited by the scarcity of rags, for the paper makers had to wait for a thrifty people to dispose of their worn-out cloth. In 1801, Zenas Crane, venturing to establish a paper mill at Dalton, Massachusetts, had to appeal to women's patriotism, their family love, and their purses to bring in enough discarded fabric. The need for rags became even more urgent when paper-making machines came into use. The first machine, invented by Nicolas Louis Robert of France, had an endless wire screen which took the place of the hand mold. A paddle wheel raised the liquid paper stock and poured it over the screen, where a side-to-side motion matted the fibers. After passing beneath a felt-covered press roll, the paper was wound on a pole and later cut into sheets to be loft-dried like handmade paper. Another type of machine, invented by John Dickinson of England, had a screen-covered cylinder which revolved in a vat of pulp. As the cylinder turned, the water passed through the screen and left a film of fiber on its surface. This film was lifted by an endless felt and carried to the press rolls. The Fourdrinier brothers of London acquired the Robert patents, and with the help of John Gamble and Brian Duncan, made many improvements in the original machine. By 1826, the complete prototype of the modern paper machine had been developed. Crude as it was, it greatly increased the speed of production, and only the continuing scarcity of paper-making materials held back the industry's growth. The search for a fiber more plentiful than rags had begun many years before. On the success of this quest rested all that paper was destined to mean to the culture, comfort, prosperity, and intellectual advancement of the civilized world. The French scientist, de Réaumur, noticed that the nest of the American wasp was made of many layers of a thin paper-like material. Careful investigation revealed that the wasps used only fibers from old weather-beaten wood, from which all resins had been removed by long exposure to the elements. As early as 1719, de Réaumur suggested that wood be tried in making paper, but many years passed before the experiment was made. The most exhaustive research was carried on by Dr. Jacob Christian Schaefer around 1765. He made paper from moss, hemp, bark, and straw, cabbage stalks and potatoes, thistles, hops, wood, and dozens of other fibrous materials. An example of each experiment is contained in his published works. Schaefer's suggestions were not utilized for want of an efficient pulping process. In 1800, straw was used by Matthias Koopes to make paper in commercial quantities, but the first commercial use of wood for paper did not come until 1840, when Friedrich Keller in Germany invented a machine to grind wood into pulp. This was followed by two chemical wood pulping processes. The Burgess caustic soda process in England in 1851, and the Tillman sulfite process in America in 1865. These wood pulping methods struck off the shackles that for centuries had bound the paper industry. At last, the dream of many men was realized. Wood fiber, plentiful and cheap, to satisfy the demands of a paper-hungry world. America, with its seemingly unlimited resources of raw material, swiftly embraced its opportunity. Mills sprang up like mushrooms. Within a few years, the United States could boast more paper mills than any other country in the world. Paper, formerly rare and precious, suddenly became abundant. Its uses multiplied overnight. Paper collars, cuffs, vests, and handkerchiefs appeared. In Boston alone, 75 million paper collars were manufactured in 1 year. Daring experiments were even made with paper corsets and petticoats. But these were only fads. The great demand was for paper to feed the nation's presses. Witnessing the rapid expansion of the paper industry, other pioneers recognized an urgent need. American-made felts for America's paper machines. One of the earliest felt weaving mills was established in 1870 in the little village of Rensselaerville, New York. The company now known as F.C. Hike & Sons. From this small beginning, the Hike Mill has grown to be the largest manufacturer of papermakers' felts in the world. A large percentage of America's paper is made on felts manufactured in this mill. All designs meet the various requirements of the paper makers. The modern paper machine on which these felts are used is a marvel of mechanical ingenuity. Though basically the same as the Ford Draneer of 1826, literally thousands of inventions and improvements have gone into its construction, increasing the speed, improving the product, and eliminating labor. To equal the output of one of these machines would require hundreds of vatmen with hand molds, thousands of felts, acres of drying racks. Corresponding improvements have been made in the cylinder machine. Great endless felts lift the fresh paper from long rows of cylinders, forming thick paper board in one operation. The board is dried on high columns of steam-heated rolls. Plentiful paper board and paper have, in 2 short years, transformed our way of life. 50 years ago, foods were distributed in bulk to be exposed to dust and dirt and the contact of human hands. Then an enterprising manufacturer ended the day of the Cracker Barrel by packaging his product in a sealed paper carton. Through national advertising, the public was told of the advantages. Soon manufacturers of other items followed, starting a cycle that changed the whole character of American business. Increased advertising enabled the publications to expand and reach greater numbers of people. Wider circulation increased the demand for paper packaged goods. Greater demand increased the sales, which in turn led to greater production, still more advertising, larger circulations, more sales, and so on. Each increase resulting in greater use of the product of the paper mill. Early in the century, wood and straw for packing began to give way to the paperboard shipping carton. Lighter than wood, it saves labor, space, and freight costs, and is of great importance to our national economy. Today, paperboard of all types accounts for more than half of the paper industry's total production. In 1909, the southern slash pine became available for the making of craft paper through the introduction of Carl Dahl's sulfate process. Craft paper for countless uses is now produced in enormous quantities. The phenomenal growth of American newspapers sent many of the newsprint mills to the great spruce forests of Canada. More and more Canadian mills were set up, and in 1918, F.C. Hike & Sons established a felt mill at Arnprior in Ontario. This mill renders a complete felt service to the Canadian paper industry, and in addition, exports felts to all parts of the world, including China, the birthplace of paper. The American paper industry as a whole has long been experimenting with new paper products and processes and sharing its discoveries through a technical association. It has worked in close cooperation with government bureaus and has constantly prepared for new demands that might be made upon it, whether for peace or for war. The First World War made use of paper in all of its conventional forms and called upon the paper mills for increased production. But it was on a certain day in December 1941 that the paper industry faced its greatest test. Here is its record.
From the moment the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor, paper became a vital instrument of war. To build a fighting force of 10 million men, hundreds of millions of paper forms were needed for registration, examination, induction. On his first day, each man filled out 18 separate forms. Paper packing was needed for uniforms and equipment. Barracks were needed with paper wallboard, paper roofing, paper insulation. Almost overnight, our armed forces became the largest users of paper in the world. Without paper, we could not have begun to fight. To finance the war, millions of paper bonds and stamps were printed. 400 million ration books proved to be the largest printing job ever undertaken. War plants throughout the length and breadth of the nation used staggering amounts of paper for records, reports, work orders, and the plans for each fighting machine. To build one battleship took more than 100 tons of paper for blueprints, communications, packaging, and in the construction itself. Paper substituted in 1,000 ways for urgently needed metals. Paper, that cheapest of materials, became so precious that the entire nation was combed for the last scrap. Paper problems never before faced grew from the strategy of a global war. Were developed. Packing cases that could lie for days in salt water and withstand the roughest handling without injury to their contents. Protective packages for food to preserve it from the insects and sweltering heat of the jungle, the bitter cold of the Arctic. Field rations were protected by paper, kept ever ready for emergency use. Paper-protected shells, large and small. Blood plasma, sulfa drugs, surgical dressings were protected by paper on perilous journeys to the battlefronts. More men lived thanks to paper. Altogether, over 700,000 different paper-packed items were shipped to our armed forces. The great volume of these supplies, plus Lend-Lease supplies to 48 other nations, required an immense quantity of paper. Many cargoes failed to reach their destination, and more paper had to replace the loss. Miles of map paper charted great areas of the globe, some waterproof, some to glow in the dark. Millions of photographs aided military operations. The continuous use of paper for plans, orders, communications, and records was behind every advance. Letters from home, newspapers, magazines, packages, books kept the morale of our fighting forces high. More than 1,000 GI newspapers kept our men the best informed soldiers ever known. Even our enemies were showered with information. by paper-carrying shells, balloons, planes. Rocket tubes were made of paper. Rings of paper were used to handle the bombs that blasted our enemies. A new and deadly atomic bomb, which hastened the war's end, required an enormous amount of paper for scientific calculations, new construction, and indispensable records. During the war years, the United States used over 2,500 carloads of paper every day. This unprecedented consumption demanded the greatest volume of paper production of all time. The American paper makers can be justly proud of their war record, which gives them credit for a substantial contribution to victory. And with an avalanche of paper, that most versatile of all materials, our nation celebrated the return of peace.
As peace returned, paper resumed its role of serving humanity in the advancement of education, in schools and libraries throughout the land, in the spread of culture, by making available the music of the great composers and reproductions of the world's great art, in the expansion of business, and in the raising of the whole standard of living. This record marks paper as one of the greatest contributions to the progress of mankind. Paper makes America the best informed nation in the world. Our presses turn out 40 newspapers every day, 30 million every Sunday, 14 million weeklies every 7 days. Paper makes possible 110 million copies of each issue of 700 magazines. Each year, paper provides the pages for 200 million books. All business depends on paper in myriad forms for correspondence, invoices, plans, filing systems, charts, maps, checks, and records of all transactions. On paper are printed the pledges of credit, money, bonds, mortgages, notes, certificates. More than 100 million paper dress patterns a year provide the way to fashionable, inexpensive clothes. Paper maps show us motor routes to new horizons and the intimate geography of every corner of the globe. Billions of paper towels, napkins, and facial tissues promote health and cleanliness. Altogether, our countless uses of paper add up to a yearly peacetime consumption of over 14 million tons, 215 pounds for every man, woman, and child. In the emergency of war, paper took new forms, supplied new needs, reached new heights in its service to man. Now, those newly developed uses and processes are being applied to the needs of a world at peace, helping to further expand business and industry, spread culture and education, bring greater comforts and conveniences to all. In peace and in war, the felt industry and the paper industry, with other allied industries, have worked together. First, to advance civilization, then to save it. They will continue to work together, applying their resources, their skill, their science, and their discoveries to the service of mankind. Yes, in the world of the future, paper will continue to be the pacemaker of progress.